It is Wednesday, June 11th, and the trade deal with China has been closed. Done. This is the big one, and it's a good one. Also, brand new inflation data released this morning. Prices refusing to surge on Trump's tariffs. What's happening here? They keep telling us prices will skyrocket. The fearmongers very disappointed. Pam Bondi dropping the hammer on LA rioters, and brand new polling showing the tide is turning. Immigrants ditching the Dem Party. New American citizens, naturalized citizens, ditching Democrats in droves. They've had it with this nonsense, apparently. Wait till you see this. But before we get started, if you appreciate these updates, like, subscribe, share the video online. It all helps out the channel, and we appreciate it.
It was the combination of Geneva's consensus coupled with the president's phone call led us to feeling actually very confident that we will work this out. Now, President Trump's got to approve it. The Chinese side has to take that back to their president. And then once that's done, we will be back on the phone together and we will then start to implement this agreement.
But do we have any breakthroughs? Any?
Well, I think we have the two largest economies in the world have reached a handshake, right, for a framework. We're going to start to implement that framework upon the approval of President Trump.
China and the U.S. agreeing to a done deal this morning after marathon negotiations this week. The deal, including rare earth exports, continue to flow unimpeded from China to the U.S. in exchange for Chinese students attending American university. Under this deal, the U.S. will receive 55% tariffs for all Chinese imports, while China gets 10%. A huge win for America. President Trump announcing the details this morning on Truth Social, writing, "Our deal with China is done, subject to final approval with President Xi and myself. Full magnets and any necessary rare earths will be supplied upfront by China. Likewise, we will provide to China what was agreed to, including Chinese students using our colleges and universities, which always has been fine with me. We are getting a total of 55% tariffs. China getting 10%. Relationship, excellent. Thank you for your attention to this matter." Trump then following up minutes later, adding to the China readout, "President Xi and I are going to work closely together to open up China to American trade. This would be a great win for both countries." The 55% tariff Trump mentions includes a 10% baseline duty, which every country in the world right now pays, plus 25% to balance out China's unfair favored nation status, plus a 20% levy for fentanyl trafficking, which you gotta admit is kind of ridiculous. China agrees, yeah, add on 20% more to allow us to continue trafficking fentanyl, pumping fentanyl into your country. How about just shutting the fentanyl trade down completely? Beijing confirming these details in their own statement this morning. Now, is this a good deal for the U.S.? Well, it's sure as hell not what Wall Street was looking for. They wanted a return to the old status quo where Trump removes all tariffs, continue the dumping of cheap made-in-China goods. This deal, a deal that leaves 55% tariffs on all imports, it's a good deal for the American working class. The levies are high enough to convince businesses to move production to the States. They're high enough to act as a forcing function in the market to force companies around the world to build their products here. If you build your products in the U.S., there's no tariff. It's tariff-free, which is what Trump's policy has always been. Return the American manufacturing base. Meanwhile, brand new spanking inflation data released this morning. For months, Trump critics have been fear-mongering that tariffs will cause surging prices, surging inflation. Well, today, this morning, the May inflation report dropping, showing inflation falls again, down to 0.1% for top-line CPI. Watch.
There's no way to look at these numbers and say they're not welcome news. I mean, a downside surprise to core goods is where people were looking for potentially tariff effects, and maybe except for isolated areas that Steve mentioned, you're not quite getting that. So I think it's all net.
It's now been nearly 5 months of Trump's tariffs. Some rolled out later, yes, others rolled out a few months ago. But every month, we're told by the media, prepare for higher prices. But it never happens. Why? Because tariffs are inherently deflationary. They've been lying to us. This morning, Trump's Treasury Secretary testifying on the Hill Watch what happens when Democrat Linda Sanchez tries gaslighting on Trump's tariffs, claiming they're causing higher prices. Bessent saying, "Excuse me, Congresswoman, but the inflation report came out this morning. There is no inflation." Her response, "You're a sexist. You are a woman hater." Secretary Bessent, watch.
In fact, we've already seen that prices are rising on many everyday goods.
Congresswoman,
please don't interrupt me.
We had
the time is mine. The time is mine. Please don't interrupt me. I will ask you questions and I will grant you an opportunity to answer them, but please don't interrupt me during my time.
With pleasure.
Okay, I know I'm a woman, but please try to limit yourself to answering my questions. No, I'm sorry, but we get talked over all the time, and I don't want that to happen at this hearing.
In another story, the tide is starting to shift in LA, really across the nation, as Americans are sick and tired of their mayors and governors allowing these violent riots to continue. Gavin Newsom last night trying to set his side's narrative. Everything to these people is political, a political opportunity. By addressing the nation last night, personally contacting all the primetime anchors, begging them to air his national address like he's the president or something. But they did. They listened to him. Almost all legacy networks carrying Gavin's speech for about 15 seconds. It turns out the California governor can't work a live stream. Watch.
And
Mark
you're
Mullen,
sitting here.
If you hang on, let's listen in on Gavin Newsom, then I'll give you a chance to respond first. I don't think we have any volume. All right. I guess we have no. Is that on their end or is it on our end? I'm asking. That's on their end. Apparently a live feed. He's having a little bit of difficulty, Mark Wayne Mullen. If you have time for podcasts and MSDNC and to fight me on X and you on X, I think you're kind of missing the point. Or if you put handcuffs on police.
And Vivek Ramaswamy made a great point last night, making the comparison between Newsom and another Democrat governor from U.S. history, George Wallace, the governor of Alabama, who famously resisted the U.S. government's efforts at desegregation. Just like Trump's doing now. In 1963, JFK had to send in the National Guard, deputize the Alabama National Guard to get the job done. Watch.
I know Gavin Newsom. I actually happen to like him as a person. The reality is he's not going to like what I have to say on this, which is that his behavior is starting to resemble that of another Democratic governor from U.S. history by the name of George Wallace, who was the governor of Alabama, who famously stood in the way of federal desegregation. And in 1963, President John F. Kennedy had to deploy the National Guard of Alabama, just like President Trump is doing today. And I know that's counterintuitive to some people, but the parallels are actually pretty striking if you think about it. Democrat governors, when you look at George Wallace, he resisted desegregation. Gavin Newsom is resisting deportations. George Wallace wanted segregated cities. Gavin Newsom wants sanctuary cities. George Wallace stood in the school door blocking the way. Gavin Newsom is blocking the ICE vans. It's the same Democrat governor playbook. You dodge the feds, you rally the radicals, and most importantly of all, you do it in front of the cameras. Because what they were both doing is really carving their Democratic primary path for their presidential ambitions. And Jesse, you can mark my words on this one. Gavin Newsom's presidential ambitions are going to end in the same place that George Wallace's did, in the dustbins of history where it belongs. That's just the truth.
And Americans writ large are waking up to this. Trump won the popular vote. He won the Electoral College, all 7 swing states, campaigning on this very issue, mass deportations, removing the 11 million illegals the Biden administration allowed into this country. And Dems beginning to now see just how badly their strategy's backfiring. It's not just longtime Americans, but new Americans, immigrant Americans, naturalized citizens are now fleeing the Dem Party. New polling showing just how badly Dems are doing with immigrants, which in 2016 was their largest voting bloc. Not anymore. Roll the tape.
Start off on the fact that immigrant citizens, immigrant voters, foreign-born voters have gone tremendously to the right on this issue in 2024 and 2025 versus where they were in 2020. Closest to or trust more in immigration. You go back to 2020. Democrats, get this, held a 32-point lead on this issue. Immigrant voters were in the Democratic camp. Jump forward to 2024, 2025. Look at that shift, a 40 point shift to the right among immigrant voters. Republicans now lead on this issue by 8 points over Democrats, more so than any other group that I could find. The group of voters who became more hawkish on immigration were, in fact, immigrants themselves, immigrants who are registered to vote in this country.
So that's on that issue. How about how they feel about kind of traditionally, historically, about Donald Trump?
Yeah. So, you see this shift and you go, what is going on underneath the hood? Well, take a look, Donald Trump. You remember when he first ran back in 2016, immigrant voters were one of his weakest spots. But look at this. Trump's vote share in presidential elections among, again, immigrant citizens, those who are registered to vote. Look at this. In 2016, he got 36% of the vote. You go to 2020, 39% of the vote. Look at this. In 2024, all the way up to 47% of the vote. Some polls I looked at had him barely losing that vote. Some polls I looked at had him barely winning that vote. Again, there is no block of voters that shifted more to the right from 2020 to 2024 than immigrant voters. And Donald Trump, at least in some surveys, actually won that vote. On average, it's about equal. So there may be all this stuff, right, about undocumented immigrants and Trump being harsh on them, but immigrant voters themselves have increasingly liked Donald Trump and have increasingly moved to the right on immigration and into the Republican camp.
Well, then on that, what you're getting at, how immigrant citizens, voters, feel about people in the country illegally.
Yeah, and this is where it all kind of comes together, Kate Baldwin. Look at this. The net favorable rating, immigrants who are here illegally, among immigrant citizens, again, those registered to vote. In 2020, look at this, plus 23 points on the net favorable rating. But look at where we were in 2024, minus 6 points, underwater. So immigrant citizens have become increasingly unfavorable in their views of those immigrants who are here illegally. So I think it's so important when we're talking about this debate from a political angle to separate those out who are undocumented immigrants versus those who are here legally and those who are citizens and those who are voters, because that group of voters has felt increasingly distant from those immigrants who are here legally. And so again, when we're talking about this, at least from a political angle, this is why Donald Trump feels so comfortable, because in fact, amongst the group that you would think that would be most opposed to this, in fact, they become increasingly favorable, not just towards Donald Trump, but towards a Republican point of view on immigration and becoming distant from those immigrants who are here illegally.
Yeah, an important baseline to consider as this plays out.
Yes, we'll see where we are in a few weeks.
Let me know what you think in the comments. Should Trump use this moment to really go to town? He has a small window of time where the public is on his side. Get to the bottom of who's organizing all of this, who's organizing these protests and riots. Someone's paying for it. Go after the people funding this. Here's Trump's rationale for sending in the National Guard and the Marines, saying if Newsom and Karen Bass won't protect LA from the rioters and looters, he will. He will proudly take up the mantle as president, governor, and mayor. He won't let it happen again like it did in 2020. Watch what he said.
You have to remember, I've been here before, and I went right by every rule, and I waited for governors to say, send in the National Guard. They wouldn't do it. They wouldn't do it, and they just wouldn't do it. It kept going on and on, got worse and worse. And in Minneapolis, that city was burning down 7 days, and I said, I don't care. The governor, who's a governor that just happened to be running for vice president, a total, you talk about an incompetent governor. He's an incompetent person. That he was picked. Well, I was actually very happy he was picked for other reasons. But this guy wouldn't call the National Guard. And we ultimately just sent in the National Guard. We stopped it. But that was after 7 days. And I said to myself, if that stuff happens again, we've got to make faster decisions because they don't want to do it. The radical left, it's usually radical left, and it's usually governors that are Democrat, and they don't want to call them in. They don't want to save lives. They don't want to save property. They don't want to call them in. I don't know what it is. We sent them in, not early. We sent them in late as far as I'm concerned. But big problems, as you know, 3 nights ago, big problems were ensuing. If we didn't send in the National Guard quickly, right now, Los Angeles would be burning to the ground.
All right, that wraps up this episode. Like, subscribe. We'll see you next time.